The United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development. What are its major goals and can they be achieved? Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo and this is The Heat. In 2015, all member states of the United Nations adopted an ambitious plan for its future. It's called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The United Nations describes it as an urgent call to action for both developed and developing countries. At its core are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. They include ending poverty and hunger, ensuring quality education, and taking urgent action to combat the climate crisis. But much has changed in the last few years, and the big question now is, can these goals be realized or are they too ambitious? To discuss all of this, joining me from Maryland is Otaviano Canuto. He's a senior fellow with the Policy Center for the New South. With us too from Phoenix is Mahmoud. He is senior fellow and director of the Climate and Water Program with the Middle East Institute. Joining the discussion from Sao Paulo is Joly. He is Emeritus Professor at the University of Campinas. And with us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is Chair Professor at Soochow University. Welcome to all of you. Otaviano Canuto, let me start with you. This is a very ambitious program. It's very comprehensive. It's known formally as the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And the UN also calls it a blueprint for peace and prosperity. How important, Otaviano, are these goals for the developing world, the countries that we sometimes collectively call the Global South?
Good day to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here back. In fact, these goals, they serve as a factor of galvanization of efforts, congregating and guiding multilateral institutions, governments, donor countries, governments of the poorest countries, and so on making the efforts and assuming the policies driving to the objectives. The SDGs, the current SDGs, they were preceded by a relatively successful effort, which were the 8 Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were more restricted to attacking extreme poverty, at the time halting the spread of HIV/AIDS, providing universal primary education, and they were established for 2000-2015. And those were better times for the world in terms of poverty reduction and so on. And so that's why it was succeeded by an even more broader effort like the SDGs, moving from 8 to 17 goals, encompassing more of attacking climate change and so on. So they serve as a galvanizer. As you aptly said at the beginning, now that we are in the middle of the third year of the COVID-19 crisis, the catastrophic effects on people's lives and livelihoods and on global efforts to realize the Sustainable Development Goals is now beyond dispute. Years or even decades of development progress have been halted or reversed.
Mahmoud, of course, as Otaviano just told us, much has changed since those goals were adopted in 2015. As he pointed out, we have the COVID pandemic with us, and there is the conflict in Ukraine, among two of the things that have changed. I recently spoke with the administrator for the UN Development Programme, Akim Steiner. I asked him whether the UN sustainability goals are a little bit too ambitious right now, given that the challenges that the world is facing. And this is some of what he said.
Well, let me put it this way. I don't think they are too ambitious, but circumstances have created extraordinary challenges. The Secretary General of the United Nations has called for us to rescue the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And if I may for a moment just point out, first of all, the 2030 Agenda is an extraordinary agreement amongst the nations of the world in 2015 that these are the great risks of our time that we can only face by working together. So the 17 SDGs really are a translation of major risks that require us to work together as a family of nations. And I think nothing in today's world would suggest that this was the wrong analysis or indeed the wrong goals. But we've come through a pandemic. We are now facing also enormous insecurity, the war of Russia and Ukraine causing a great deal of further disruption. Also, the ability of the international community to work together effectively is clearly being affected by these developments. So are the targets and timelines really realistic at the moment? Well, to many, they may seem out of reach, but let's also not mistake the fact that on some goals, there is significant progress.
So, Mohammed, how do you think the COVID pandemic, as well as the conflict in Ukraine, have affected, or rather impacted, progress on trying to implement these goals? And of course, there are also other things that the conflict has caused. Among them, it's affected energy supplies and prices. It's exacerbated inflation as well. And we're also seeing something of a food shortage right now.
Yeah, first of all, Nan, thanks for having me. I'm happy to join the conversation and the program. You know, look, the way I observe what's happening in context to the SDGs is really simply that they are truly goals, right? And as the comments that you shared earlier with your conversation with Akeem Steiner is that maybe the timeline is not realistic, but the goals are still very much important. And I think what we're realizing is there are overlays that occur in context to these goals that affect our ability to achieve them. Certainly the Ukraine-Russia crisis has impacted certainly a number of those goals. When we think about achieving zero poverty, or we think about the energy, achieving clean energy, those are goals that are suffering a setback because of the implication of that crisis on food security and energy to other regions around the world. Similarly, when we think about COVID, ironically, the beginning of the pandemic, when the world halted momentarily, we saw very modest positive outcomes in terms of things like carbon emission and environmental benefits. But as the world surged back in the last year or so, we're seeing impacts that have regressed us in a different direction when we think about supply chain issues and we think about how that affects productivity and areas of sustainability for cities. So certainly the goals themselves remain important, but I think it makes us realize that certain overlays, certainly the crisis in Ukraine, certainly the impact of the pandemic, and I would also argue the climate crisis that we're moving in. We're seeing very accelerated impacts of climate change affecting human life in a number of ways, in a number of sectors. So recognizing that these are goals, they're still important, but also understanding that we may not be able to achieve them in the original timeline in an absolute sense, but addressing them and trying to achieve them incrementally can help address some of these other overlays that we're experiencing at the moment.
Carlos, Joly, one of the UN Sustainable Goals is to grow economies and also to achieve full employment in many countries. Now, you are in Brazil right now. Brazil is a country that is hit very hard by COVID. So in the light of that, how difficult is it going to be for Brazil to implement these goals?
Thank you for inviting me again. Surely COVID has made a lot of damage to Brazilian economy, but not only COVID. I think that the line of the current government has also helped throwing a large part of our population back into hunger. And surely at the moment we don't have the political will to proceed in terms of reaching these goals. In my vision, if you look at the traditional picture of the 17 goals, you have a wedding cake where in the basis you have goal 14, that is life in water, and goal 15, that is life in land. So that's biodiversity, something that Brazil is the country with the highest biodiversity in the world. Instead of using that natural capital for the development, we are destroying it. We are burning the Amazon forest even before we know which species are there. So this shows that perhaps looking at the goals, like Akin Steiner mentioned in his talk, is a way of bringing together the world in terms of overcoming this crisis that we are living at the moment. And for that, we need changing the behavior of governments, but also changing the behavior of citizens.
Carlos, when you say that there isn't the political will in Israel to implement some of these goals, why is that? Brazil, sorry.
Brazil, sorry. Yeah, because the way it's the present government looks at it is that you need to expand areas for having more cattle ranching, for having more food production, and you don't need that. You don't need to destroy the forest for that, because we have a lot of areas that have been degraded that could be used for expansion on food production. So they're looking for the immediate outcome, or the profit they will get very immediately. They don't look at the long term, where you are at the same time you are destroying biodiversity and you are contributing to the climate change, because you are burning forest that is a stock of carbon, and you are throwing that carbon in the atmosphere. So it's completely out of the possibilities of thinking that somebody can be so mistaken on how to treat the environment and how to look at those goals.
Victor Gao, you are joining us from Henan province, not from Beijing, as I said, but great to see you. Of course, the global economy has taken a big hit with COVID. We see, for instance, China has been affected as well, but China has also had a lot of success in things like alleviating poverty. But what about its commitment to achieving some of the other major goals of the sustainability program? Things like equality, reducing inequality within and among countries.
Thank you very much for having me. Greetings from Sanya, which is a major tourist city in Hainan province. And Hainan Island is soon becoming the largest free trade zone in the whole world. And when we look at the SDG set to be achieved by 2030, it is truly very disappointing that it is not progressing as satisfactorily as we, the mankind, originally expected. But there are several reasons. I think for SDG to be achieved, you need to have peace, you need to promote development, you need to have the whole world united under the United Nations and moving more or less in the same direction. However, it is truly very sad to see that the world is not behaving like that. So rather than blaming the SDG set for 2030, we need to reflect. We need to blame ourselves, the countries involved, and the lack of international cooperation, and the lack of the will of moving in the same direction. Now, in this regard, I think China stands out as a shining example, because by 2020, China already eliminated abject poverty as a phenomenon in China. Of course, there are still huge income disparities among the Chinese people because the population is very big, 1.4 billion, spreading out across a huge landmass, etc. So we have a lot of job to do to promote more equality of income and wealth among the people in China. And also, China is really fast doing its job in promoting international cooperation across the board with many countries. And I think in this regard, the Belt and Road Initiative, originally initiated by China, is a major part of the global effort to achieve SDG, because all these things are interconnected. You are talking about elimination of poverty. You are talking about creating jobs. You are talking about providing more care for the disadvantaged people. And then climate change is very much, a part of this whole global effort. We do not have the global setup right now. And for example, peace and stability are very important. And we hope there will be no war. But if there is a war breaking out, what should we do? we need to do everything we can through diplomacy to put that war out, rather than to do everything to make sure that that war is more prolonged. So I think this is the time for us to reflect and blame our own shortcomings and incompetence, in a sense, not for the purpose of blaming ourselves, but to redouble our efforts to make sure that the goals set for 2030 under SDG can be realistically achieved, and any delay or procrastination on the behalf of countries involved, especially developed countries, in helping the developing countries in the world, need to really be corrected. And we move forward with new dedication and commitment to achieve these goals, because these goals are so well defined and they are really meant for a better world and for mankind for many generations to come, because we do not want to live in a divided world with huge disparity of income and wealth and distribution of wealth among the people in different parts of the world. The gap between the developed world and the developing world really need to be narrowed as quickly as possible.
Otaviano, when we look around the world right now, we see that inflation is raging, especially if we look at the prices of food going up in many, many countries. And there is a big risk that people could be driven into poverty by these price rises. We look at the situation in Ukraine, that conflict is continuing there. And to what extent, are these issues going to be undermining the efforts that are being made to achieve those goals?
They have already done so. Look, it is really a very peculiar, extraordinary moment through which we are living. It's the combination of overlapping shocks, overlapping in the sense that their effects are cumulative in bad directions. You think of the consequences of the pandemic, the sluggish recovery of the pandemic crisis in the poor part of the country, of the world. You think of the effects of the pandemic on health, on education, and so on, particularly of the poor people. You add then the war in Ukraine and the subsequent shock in prices of energy and food. You add as well put before the frequency of extreme weather events. We had droughts in Brazil, in the U.S. West, the heat in the soil in India, and then we can name here several. And it's pretty clear that apparently the frequency of those extraordinary events have become higher, with effects on not only directly on people and on migration flows, but also on food production. So we will have hunger, war, and the pandemic and climate. The UN report on the SDG for 2022, the draft that has been made available, mentions and estimates that these combined crises will lead 75 million more people, between 75 and 95 million people to live in extreme poverty in 2022 compared to the projections prior to the pandemic.
Okay, Mahmoud, let's move on to the climate crisis. Recently, there was a new warning issued by the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
We are on a fast track to climate disaster. Major cities underwater, unprecedented heat waves, terrifying storms, widespread water shortages, the extinction of 1 million species of plants and animals. And this is not fiction or exaggeration. It is what science tells us will result from our current energy policies.
So it seems, Mohammed, that there is a recognition throughout the world that the climate crisis is upon us, that it poses enormous threats to us. But why has there been so little progress in combating this crisis? I mean, for instance, what are the stakes for North Africa and the Middle East?
The stakes are huge, and we're seeing the effects now. I'll speak on the Middle East and North Africa, but other parts of the world are seeing these effects in different levels. And I think of it in terms of three main areas. public health issue in the sense that the driver to all of these climate change implications is increased temperature. Increased temperature primarily born of higher carbon emissions in the atmosphere. So with that increase in temperature, you have a higher incidence of extreme heat effects. Certainly the Middle East, North Africa region is one of the warmer, hotter, naturally prone to be hotter and drier regions of the world. That is being amplified. You have higher incidences of extreme weather in the case of what we've been seeing since April, May of this year in terms of increased frequency of dust storms. That also poses a public health issue. I also think about safety and security. When we think about other extreme weather events, we saw in the Arabian Peninsula, certainly an amplification last year, of cyclonic activity originating from the Arabian Sea, causing damages to the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula. And then slowly but surely, with time, amplifying the effects of sea level rise. So that's now encroaching on areas of land that could be already being used for urban areas, agricultural production, or even industrial. And then finally, the sustainability issue that's being impacted, which is reduction in availability of water supply, not just to meet human needs, but also to meet food production. About 60 or 70% of water use by nations is going towards agricultural production. It is a water-intensive enterprise, but it is a necessary enterprise to supplement food production and to avoid a food crisis issue, which is going to potentially increase in terms of risk because of reduction of water supply, because of increase in aridification and drought.
Carlos, you were talking a moment ago about the Amazon rainforest, and of course this is a region of the world that is of deep concern, not just to Brazil, but the entire globe. And we know that it's also the focus of politics in Brazil as well. We've seen a lot of deforestation already in the Amazon rainforest. But what is the situation right now? What is Brazil doing about deforestation there? And what do you think needs to be done?
Well, unfortunately, the Brazilian government is doing very little to reduce the burning of the forest. This month, the figures of number of fires in the Amazon region just came out today, and it's a new record for the month, as the previous month was a record as well. And it seems that as we are in an election year and people are thinking of a possible change in environmental policies in Brazil, they are destroying as fast as they can before this change happens. So although the scientific community is doing a lot of movements and trying to come up with solutions where you do have development and a better quality of life for the 23 million people that live in the Amazon basin, because we have to look at them as well. It's not only the forest that's there, but what we want is a development with the forest, or use the forest as the main asset for the development. And you have a lot of products that you can harvest from the forest, and you can use the forest as an environmental service, because it's a carbon stock, is important for water. The whole water regime in South America depends on the Amazon. So I think that we need to do more, but this will happen in a new government, not until the end of this year.
Victor Gar, if we look at the situation in China, I mean, the country was recently hit by flooding, major flooding in the country, and it also saw a major typhoon recently as well. But China is also committed to achieving what it calls a climate resilient society by 2030. How will the country achieve that?
Well, first of all, from China's experience, indeed, the global change is happening and is generating huge havoc to the people in all parts of China. The weather patterns are changing very rapidly. Lots of people will be impacted. And I suppose the people in the rest of the world are going through the same process. So wake up. There is no time to be wasted. Now, for the climate to be better managed in China, I think we need to do several things. One is really to achieve our goal of CO2 peaking by 2030 and CO2 neutrality by 2060. And I truly believe that once the Chinese government and the Chinese people are completely aligned, we will move steadily in the same direction to do our job and going through all the sacrifices and readjustments that's necessary. Secondly, we really need to set up all the monetary system. Hello?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes. Secondly, we need to set up a national monitoring system to really observe and analyze and monitor all these changes in the weather pattern and how the whole nation as a whole can do major readjustments in different ways in different parts of China. Now, thirdly, every one of us, the 1.4 billion people, need to be fully mobilized because every little bit each of us will do in the right way will contribute to the whole national good we will do as a whole nation and as a whole country. And then international cooperation will be crucially important because I truly believe no country can hide behind the wall of national isolation because this climate change is truly a global phenomenon. And if other countries fail in their duties and any other country do the right thing, it's not sufficient. So mankind needs to be united, moving in the same way, and hopefully the United Nations remains the only viable international organization to lead mankind in the right direction.
Otaviano, very quickly, I've only got about 20 seconds. One of the other big goals is achieving quality, equitable education. Can that be done, especially in the developing world?
Well, the problem is that the pandemic brought a global education crisis. Just to give you a couple of figures, the school closures brought by the pandemic had consequences on children's learning and well-being. The estimate is that 147 million children missed more than half of their in-class instruction over the past 2 years. And that's going to have, is estimated, an impact on lifetime earnings in present value, something close to $17 trillion.
Right. Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and thanks for a great discussion. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.